Most of the goals we set for ourselves, large and small, we pursue them because we expect them to make us content. Surely we'll be happy once we get a great job or find a life partner or lose 10 pounds or perfect our pickleball game. But often when we get one reward, our brains suddenly fixate on something else to wish for. It is not so different from the way successful startups are constantly raising their revenue targets. From KERA in Dallas, this is Think. I'm Krys Boyd. We're never really done pursuing happiness, which is not to say there isn't joy to be found in the journey. And my guest believes that of all the skills he can help his Harvard Business School students cultivate, the project of managing their own lives is the most important. Arthur C. Brooks is Parker Montgomery Professor at Harvard, and he is also a columnist at The Atlantic, where he writes the weekly How to Build a Life column. His newest book is titled The Happiness Files: Insights on Work and Life. Arthur, welcome to Think.
Thank you, Krys. Great to be with you.
What does it mean for any one of us to approach the management of our own lives like we might manage a startup business?
Well, the truth is that each of our lives is kind of like a startup. I'm not trying to businessize life, but when you think about it, what entrepreneurs are trying to do is that they're taking a big swing at something that's important to them. They're willing to take risks in search of something that's kind of outsized in its rewards. Now, life is like that too. We take a lot of risks, we face a lot of suffering, we have a lot of uphill battles, but we're trying to do it in service of real rewards, not rewards like entrepreneurs and business are. It's not money or power or market share or anything like that. I mean, some people are thinking about that for their own lives, but really what we're trying to get is love and happiness, which is an audacious entrepreneurial thing to want. So I teach my students, look, you might be startup entrepreneurs. I teach at the Harvard Business School after all. And I say, that's great if you do that. But the real business is the business of your life. So treat your life like a true enterprise.
Do we need like a business plan for our own happiness? Do we need to define what it means for us individually?
Not necessarily. And a lot of entrepreneurs actually don't have a business plan. As a matter of fact, only about 40% of successful business entrepreneurs have an actual business plan. If you buy a book on it, they'll say, oh, yeah, you have to know exactly where you're going. Well, most of us in our business lives, and we don't know. I mean, my guess is, Krys, you didn't have your whole career laid out in front of you. And you'd be pretty shocked 10 years from now to look back right now and think what you were going to see. That's the serendipity of life. That's the adventure of life. What you have to have is a lot of really good habits. You have to have a lot of good ways to structure your own life so that you have the highest chance of getting the love and happiness that you really want and you want to bring to others.
I love that your very first chapter here is all about failure because it is something that we try really hard to avoid. You say instead we should try to get good at failing.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of specialize in strivers, charging people who are extremely ambitious. It's because they study the Harvard Business School. But then again, the listeners to this show, too, are taking their lives pretty seriously. They like ideas and they want to be successful in terms of what they're trying to do with their work and lives and careers. And I think that's really great. What holds people back the most who are strivers is kind of a death fear, as a matter of fact, Krys. You know, I've done a lot of work. I've been working for the past 13 years with the Dalai Lama. And what the Tibetan Buddhists talk about all the time is getting over your fear of death because it's the most inevitable part of life. And only when you don't fear your death will you be free to live, is how they talk. Well, the truth is that people who are very ambitious and hardworking, they're very afraid of failure. The most afraid of failure, the greatest fear I've ever seen is among the people who fail the least. They don't have any reps in it. And so the result is that, you know, my students are terrified of failing and it holds them back from living like a startup entrepreneur in their lives. They don't take enough risk. Some of them are so afraid of failure, they won't ask somebody out on a date, for Pete's sake. And, you know, what else is your 20s about is, you know, taking that kind of risk. And so I talk to them about how to understand failure, get good at failure, learn from failure, grow from failure, and suffering and all the other things you think you don't want, but you actually need.
You actually suggest writing a CV of failure, like writing down all the ways in which we have failed. Most of us cannot forget big failures. Do we really need to go through the exercise of putting them down on paper?
The answer is yes, because when we don't benefit from them. Then we just kind of have it as a phantasm, like a ghost up in the attic. They bother us, but we don't explicitly get the learning and benefit from them that we do if we're able to analyze them. So here's the problem with our feelings. People don't understand emotions very well. What they are is a universal language in the limbic system of the brain that indicates to us when there are threats and opportunities. The negative emotions say there's something out there that might be bad for you that you should avoid, and the positive feelings suggest there's an opportunity that you should approach. That's really all emotions are. What happens is that when we leave our strong experiences in the limbic system, we don't consider them, when we don't meditate on them, when we don't write them down and talk about them, we never move them to the executive centers of our brain, which is called the prefrontal cortex. And if we do, we can learn a lot from them and we can actually put them into perspective. Hey, that thing didn't kill me. That's pretty interesting. I actually benefited from it. Oh, that's really great. And so I ask my students to keep a journal of failure and disappointment. I mean, you can keep a journal of gratitude if you want, but this is really for the pros. Is, when something you don't like happens, write it down, and then 3 weeks later, come back and underneath it, write down what you learned from that. About 3 months later, come back and write down how you benefited from it. And there's always something. I mean, it might not be. You might not be saying hooray for that failure, but there is always something good that came from it. And in doing that, you really learn by installing it in the executive centers of your brain. And after about the fourth failure, you start to look forward to going back to your journal because you get to look at the victories that are above it that you're now writing underneath.
To be happier, you advise we spend less time doing things we hate. I think this is, intuitive advice for everyone. But, we all have lots of things that we have to get done. How can we tell the difference between the ones we can let go of and the ones we really have to do?
The truth of the matter is that there are things that we have to do that we don't like. We don't really hate those things. These are things that are sacrifices for us, or they might be uncomfortable for us. But the things that we really hate are big signals, generally speaking, that we're using our lives in a kind of a counterproductive way. When we're with people because we feel like this is really good for me to hang out with this person, but the person is just toxic and bothering me and bumming me out and lowering my quality of life, that's a big signal that is not passing the cost benefit ratio. None of us is getting any younger. As the years are passing by, we need to make good cost benefit decisions. And so I ask my students, and more importantly, I mean, my whole mission is public education. I'm doing hundreds of these, talks in media and on stages a year, talking to older people than my students. And I say, are you doing things that you used to feel like you had to do just because of your old attachments? I recommend that the people that I talk to have a kind of a reverse bucket list, a to-don't list over the course of the year, where they start getting rid of these old attachments, the things that don't serve them and the relationships that are very toxic to them, and say, I'm not going to do that this year. Really start to chip away some of these attachments. And when they chip away, it's like a sculpture. There's nothing wrong with the things that you're chipping away morally, but what you'll find inside is the real beautiful sculpture, the work of art that is you, only when you get rid of the parts that are, not you.
A lot of people thought that remote work would be a cure for burnout, and it has not worked out that way for many people. What's going on?
Yeah, I read about that a lot in this new book, in the Happiness Files, because this is really a manual for a lot of people who are trying to get happier over the course of their careers and work. It's kind of a work-focused book, as a matter of fact. And so I can't not talk about remote work. This is the big phenomenon of our time. It is incredibly convenient. And the truth is that probably you and I would not be looking at each other on this Zoom-based technology or a virtually based technology had it not been for the coronavirus epidemic that sent everybody home. This is the mother of invention, to be sure. I've become unbelievably efficient at my work. I can give a speech in Milan and Denver on the same day, which is wonderful as far as it goes. The problem is that when we rely on that too much, human beings actually need to bond to one another. We are evolved to actually make kinship ties with the people that we live with and even the people that we work with to a certain extent. We have a neuropeptide in the brain that helps us do that called oxytocin. It's a bonding molecule, as a matter of fact. And you get that from eye contact and touch. When you first lay eyes on your newborn baby and you lock eyes on the infant, and it's like the 4th of July inside your head for mom and dad. And that's something that we all need. We're built for that. When we don't have that, we're intensely uncomfortable. Well, the era of Zoom has been really deleterious for that. It's not as if your colleagues at work or your newborn infant. These are not your brothers and sisters, but the truth is you need those bonds as well. And when people don't see anybody else in person, they get an intense kind of neurochemical withdrawal. It makes them lonely. It makes them depressed and anxious. It makes them want to consume more highly glycemic carbohydrates. And well, if the refrigerator is right there, it becomes even more of a problem. So, I mean, it's like, yeah, find ways. And if you can't go back to work because you're permanently at a distance, go find humans. You got to spend more time with the humans.
Procrastination is not necessarily a bad thing. When can it be a good thing?
Procrastination is a natural defense such that you can ruminate productively on something that's important to you. Now, that said, I've procrastinated a lot when I've had a book that was due to my publisher and I was having a hard time with it. And well, I'll get to it tomorrow. And, that's just nothing more than putting off something that's unpleasant, putting off the inevitable that I don't like. But a lot of times when I have a big creative project, I find that if I put it off until the next day, I will naturally place it into a zone neurochemically for me where I'm more creative and I'm more focused. So I'll give you an example. If during the afternoon, I'm trying to work on one of my columns in the Atlantic, or I'm working on a book chapter or something like that, and I'm having a hard time with it, I will just consciously put it off until the next day. That's very productive procrastination. Why? Because I have more dopamine in my brain first thing in the morning, and I will solve something in 15 minutes. It would have taken me 3 hours to solve the afternoon before. So strategic procrastination can be a very, very good technique for greater efficiency and higher quality work.
But most of us, or often we're not doing it strategically. How can we know if our procrastination is really just an excuse?
Well, if you're putting it off day after day after day, that's a pretty good signal. If you're putting it off for one day because you think that tomorrow you'll be a little bit more inspired to do it, that's a better sign that you're on the right track. And in fact, one of the things that I recommend to people is when they're putting together something pretty creative, to do 90% and leave the next 10% for the next day on purpose. You'll wind up actually having a better ending to what you're working on, and you'll have an overall better product because you'll go back through it. And when you go back through it the next day, you'll have a second pass at it that's using your brain the way your brain is supposed to be used.
What was the Hemingway trick?
The Hemingway trick, well, Hemingway had some special problems. Hemingway drank like a fish, and that's one of the best ways to ruin your creativity. Drinking heavily or using any euphoric substances, cannabis, any other drugs or behaviors that spike your dopamine. What that does is, in spiking your dopamine, usually in the evening, you get a hangover, and part of the hangover that you get is insufficient dopamine in the morning. Now, insufficient dopamine in the morning is you're going to feel unfocused and uncreative, and everybody who's had a couple of benders under their belt who's listening to us right now knows how that feels. Like, yeah, I drank too much last night. Well, I can't get focused on my work and I don't feel very creative. That's why, because your dopamine is way below baseline the next day. Well, that was every day for Hemingway. So what happened with Hemingway is he had to let himself recover and get over his daily hangover. And then he knew he was only going to have about 2 hours of focused productivity as a novelist. If you're writing fiction, you need dopamine. You need a lot of dopamine because it's a pure creative endeavor. So what he did was, when he knew he was going to start feeling creative, to keep him in the zone, he would take his typewriter. His typewriter was in the closet and it was facing the back wall of the closet. And he would go in, standing up, looking at the closet wall, and wouldn't leave until he had actually typed and worked on whatever novel he was working on for 2 solid hours, knowing that that was pretty much all he was going to get. And then he was, back to the bottle.
It's remarkable that he had the discipline to form this habit for himself, but not to quit drinking.
Yeah, he figured out a way to do both. This is one of the things that I recommend to my students. The truth of the matter is, it was pretty romantic in those days to be a hard drinking artist, but the history and science have not smiled on that approach very much at all. A lot of our younger listeners are actually drinking a lot less than their elders, than their parents did, because it's a neurotoxic substance. For your creativity and productivity and happiness and health, the best number of drinks per day is actually 0, is the way that turns out. And so what I tell my students is, there's basically 3 things that you can do really well, but you can only do 2 of them at a time. You can be excellent at family, you can be excellent at work, and you can be excellent as an alcoholic. You can do 2 of those things at the same time, but you got to pick the 2. And they think about it a little bit and they say, I think I like career and family. I say, good choice. Hemingway didn't make that choice.
Arthur, you share here that you are very good at saying yes to things that excite you, not so good at saying no. What does that have to do with hyperbolic discounting?
Well, basically, the reason I say yes to everything has to do with the fact that I'm an incredibly high affect person. Now, what that means is that's just, behavioral science gobbledygook. People like me who've suffered through PhDs have to have a special word for everything. High affect personality means somebody who feels both positive and negative emotions very intensely and tends to exhibit those emotions very intensely as well. About a quarter of the population is in the high positive, high negative category. Now, those people in general have a hard time saying no to things because they look at things that are far away and they say, if you offer me something cool that's a few months out, I want to say yes because I'm going to get a little benefit from saying the yes right now, despite the fact that I'm going to pay a lot to actually go do the gig. And so, if you say, hey, you want to do balloon animals for my nephew's bar mitzvah in Fairbanks next March? I'll be like, Fairbanks in March, sign me up. But then, March comes along and I'm like, man, it's cold in Fairbanks. I don't even know how to do balloon animals. So I have to be very careful about that, given the fact that I tend to, the further out you ask me to do something, the more likely I am to say yes, because of my natural personality affect profile. The result of that is that I have to have people around me who protect me from myself. The people that I work with are like, don't tell Arthur that there was this opportunity because he will say yes. And I've actually built these screens for myself so I don't say yes too often.
And are you thinking about future regret? Like maybe March comes along and your nephew has no balloon animals in Fairbanks and you feel bad about that?
Not really. I'm just thinking about future adventure, and something right now that's far out sounds fun to me. And that's really what I want. I mean, my life is all about having maximum numbers of adventures, which is why I've done a lot of stuff. I was a musician for a long time, a professor for a long time. I ran a company for a long time. And now the best. Now I get to actually travel around the world talking about happiness with people. And it's an unbelievable blast is the whole thing. So I have a big bias for novelty, meaning especially if you would offer me an opportunity to do something I've never done before. So balloon animals for a bar mitzvah while jumping out of an airplane over the Mekong Delta, sign me up.
It's interesting that as an admitted high affect person, I don't know that you need to admit it. I think it's pretty evident talking to you, but you also write about the value of emotional self-control, of keeping things
Yeah.
a little bit buttoned up. I think for our generation, this is something that was maybe more valued than it is today. Talk a little bit about how we maybe misinterpret what we will get out of letting all of our emotions hang out all the time.
Yeah. So despite being a high affect person, I try hard to make sure that I'm managing my emotions so they don't manage me. And you really have those choices. I mean, we've all met somebody who's a high affect person, but also a highly reactive person. When they're angry, they yell without thinking, and then they have to apologize. When they're sad, they cry, even at work. These are people who will, laugh really loud and then feel embarrassed about something they shouldn't have been laughing about. And there's a reason for that in a lot of cases. As a matter of fact, there's a whole class of citizens in our society that can't control their emotions. They're called little kids. I live with my little grandson, Joseph, and, he's 2 years old and he's a dictator. When he doesn't like something, he lets you know about it and he's got you running around, as a matter of fact. And it's sort of successful, which is why he does it. But, then he apologizes in his own way and it's hard for him. Now, the reason is because he's not synaptically wired. His brain is not fully developed. As a matter of fact, the brain development that we're talking about is the emotional console in our brains, the limbic system, and then the place where we make the decisions, which is the prefrontal cortex. And the wiring between those two parts of the brain is not complete in human females until the age of 21. In human males, I think it's like 70, which is a different problem. And so the result of it is we all have to work harder to make sure that we're consciously trying to move the experience of our emotions from the limbic system into the prefrontal cortex so that we can be making the decisions to display the emotions that we want to display. I mean, many philosophers have talked about this. Baruch Spinoza, the famous Jewish Portuguese philosopher who lived in Amsterdam in the 17th century, he talked an awful lot about the fact that you should wait when you're feeling something. And that was kind of the Jeffersonian admonition to count to 10 when you're angry or count to 100 when you're really angry. And all they're saying is wait for your emotions, wait for your prefrontal cortex to catch up to your limbic system so that your emotions are not expressing themselves. You're deciding which parts of your affect that you want to share with others.
Nothing can steal happiness from a day like feeling worried. What separates regular worriers from chronic worriers?
Well, that's a question of rumination. And rumination is actually, it comes from ruminare, which is the verb in Latin for to chew the cud. A cow chews the cud. And that's where rumination comes from. And we all know how this feels, where you're going over regret or something you're anxious about. And anxiety, by the way, is a form of unfocused fear. And the lack of focus and its low intensity means we can kind of chew on it and chew on it and chew on it. And when we do so, that's worry. Worry is funny because worry is, generally speaking, not focused on any specific fear, because our brain is pretty good at keeping the source of the actual fear away from us. But when we don't consider what we're really worried about, then we'll just chew on that cud all day long. And people who do that chronically, they have a pretty low quality of life. There's a part of your brain dedicated to that rumination. It's called a ventrolateral prefrontal cortex. Nobody needs to remember that. But if you want to write it down, folks, VLPFC, just, Google that and you'll find it. And that part of the brain is dedicated to ruminative sadness in clinical depression, to creative activities, and even to romantic love when you're falling in love with somebody and can't stop thinking about them. It's also associated with low levels of serotonin, which is associated with clinical depression. And so the result of that is that we tend to find a certain kind of person who's creative and romantic and also kind of depressed and ruminating on things all the time. So there's some good things that come along with it, but it can be really, really tricky to manage.
I had not thought about this, but you write about the fact that chronic worriers, some of them are even a little bit superstitious. Like, if I worry enough about this terrible thing that I hope doesn't happen, then it can't possibly happen because I've worried enough.
Yeah, that's what a lot of warriors think, because they've been able pretty successfully over the course of their lives to reason certain things out. And so they think that worrying is a certain form of reason. Worry becomes a totemic activity where I'm going to ruminate on this thing over and over and over again. And just the worrying itself will keep the demons at bay, will keep the bad thing from actually happening, which of course is nonsense. And when people are metacognitive, which is to say that they're using their prefrontal cortex very consciously about that, they can self-manage to the point that they let go of some of these superstitious feelings.
Telling somebody not to worry works about as well as telling someone to calm down when they seem agitated. Why is it helpful to write down the thing that's worrying us?
Yeah, that's a good point. And, people have all told us, I'm kind of a worrier. I'm a very anxious person, and my wife's not. And, she's pretty chill, as a matter of fact. And when she sees me really stressed out about something, she'll say, don't worry about it. Look, if it comes to pass, it comes to pass. Unhelpful. So what's really helpful is any technique that will move it from, the more primitive parts of your brain to the more modern parts of your brain. There are parts of your brain where you make executive decisions. And the best way to do that is writing something down. That's why journaling is so unbelievably helpful. I ask my students to keep fear journals, anxiety journals. And what that's all about is thinking about the things they're very anxious and worried about, and then writing them down in their journal. Underneath each one of these entries, I ask them to write, what's the worst case scenario, the best case scenario, the most likely case scenario, and then to assign some subjective probabilities to each one and a strategy to what you're going to do if each one of these things comes to pass. Now, what's really happening, I mean, this is probably good for decision making, but more importantly, what that's doing is engaging the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain where you can say, I was worried about something that's a very low probability, and I actually know what I would do if this came to pass. And in so doing, you will find that you'll probably be able to sleep better, maybe for the first time in a long time.
This sounds a little bit like DIY cognitive behavioral therapy.
Yeah, no, it's very related to a lot of cognitive behavioral and mindfulness techniques. And because all of cognitive behavioral therapy is all different ways of practicing metacognition, understanding yourself, moving your emotional experiences into the front of your head, the meaty bumper of tissue behind your forehead where you make your conscious decisions, and becoming an expert in yourself. That's what's really going on. I tell my students, look, your psychology is biology, so you have to understand your brain. And when you manage your brain in a thoughtful way, you can get a lot happier, and also you'll be a lot more grateful for the way that your brain is working.
Arthur, what do we know about the extent to which money can actually buy happiness?
There's a lot of debate about that. And the debate between economists is always kind of a blunt one. I was trained as an economist, so I understand the problems that economists have in talking about certain things in behavior. They always will say, how much money is enough? In other words, at what point does happiness flatten out? And there was an early paper by Daniel Kahneman and Angus Deaton. These are two Nobel Prize winning economists about 15 years ago that said it's $75,000 a year, $75,000 a year, very specific amount of money, because what they found using a very large sample of Americans is that's when contentment and life satisfaction flattened out. Now, later, a guy at Penn, a professor at Penn named Matt Killingsworth, he found that it was a much higher number. Well, finding the exact number isn't the right approach. The truth is that at some point there is a number where your happiness is going to start flattening out. What really matters is your motive for earning money and what you do with your money is what it comes down to. If your motive for earning money is being a big shot, comparing yourself to others, or trying to measure your own self-worth, there's never enough. I have the data on that. Psychologists, other behavioral scientists have been studying that for generations. That's bad. And so we actually have to fix that if that's the case. The second thing that's worth keeping in mind is how you spend it makes all the difference. If you're buying things, flashy things, expensive watches and cars because you want to show off how resource rich you are because you're trying to get mates or whatever it happens to be, it's not going to bring happiness. It just isn't. Mother Nature wants you to do that, but Mother Nature doesn't care if you're happy, Krys. There are really only 4 ways to buy happiness, and none of them are these kind of ancient peacocking things that people do. One is to buy experiences, but to quietly spend them with people that you love. Another is to buy time and to quietly spend it in self-edifying activities. Another is to give your money away, but not to give your money away publicly and put your name on a building. And last but not least is to save your money. The least sexy thing you can possibly do with your money is to save it, but that gives you a sense of progress. And those are the 4 ways to actually buy happiness, and none of them involves a Ferrari.
When you say buy time, you mean outsource tasks that we might otherwise do for ourselves.
That's right. And if you can afford to create jobs, that's great. I mean, it's like, go create a job. If you can afford to pay somebody to cut your grass, pay somebody to cut your grass. They'll be delighted to cut your grass and take your money. But then there's the second part of the deal, which is that you have to spend the time doing something meaningful. Spend the time in prayer, go for a hike in the woods. Meditate with your partner. You can't spend it scrolling Instagram. That doesn't count because you're frittering away your time and you'll wind up unhappier.
Lots of people will know someone who has enough money to pay for all the basics, maybe even some extras, and still suffers from a significant degree of financial anxiety. What are we still worried about if we can be pretty certain that we'll be able to keep a roof over our heads and food on the table?
Yeah, no, that comes from a couple of different sources. And number one is a lot of people who grow up in poverty, they never quite believe they're not going to wind up in poverty again. It's a really, really common insecurity. And metacognition, where you're actually paying attention to your own thinking process, can help you a lot with that, because an inchoate worry that doesn't make sense shouldn't be holding you back. This is one of the reasons that therapists will try to make you think about what the source of your fear is. One of the ways to do that is by really leaning into that fear, saying, what would it mean for me to be poor? How likely is it that could actually ever happen? And you're using your prefrontal cortex in that case. The other thing that people actually do along these lines, where they have a significant amount of anxiety about this, is, people who from a very young age were taught that everything has to be earned, including the love of others. So very high-performing young people, for example, the only time they get love and attention, or at least affection and attention from their parents, is when they bring home a good report card, and when they get on the sports team or first chair in the orchestra and get into a good university and then get a really good job. And they spend the rest of their lives trying to earn everybody else's love. When they think about actually not earning as much or bringing home as much or peacocking as much, they sort of intuitively think that the love that they have for people around them, their children, their parents, their partner, God, it might disappear.
So hearing that about parents who make their kids think that they are not loved unless they achieve is concerning. But you actually say parents should worry a little bit less about how their children will turn out. I think with the caveat that, we need to take good care of them.
That's true. And, when I talk about children feeling like they have to earn everything, I mean, I know a lot of people shaking their heads because they're high performers and like, that's it. I've been trying to earn my partner's love because mom didn't give me enough love until I brought home A's on the report card. Don't blame mom. Mom was just doing the best that she possibly could. Mom might have been brought up under hard circumstances and wants you to be successful. That just doesn't turn out to be a very good technique. But the truth of the matter is that we all can write our own life story. That's the most beautiful part about it. Once you understand these things, you can get beyond these things. And so I talk an awful lot about the fact that we all have these patterns of our behavior. And the most important thing that we can do is to become experts in ourselves, which is why I teach the class that I do. You need a PhD in Krys Boyd studies.
Assuming that people are reasonably employable, Arthur, what keeps us in jobs that really don't make us happy?
We become what economists call path dependent. People stay in jobs because that's what they've done, and the transaction costs are high of moving, but also they're really afraid of what they haven't seen before. I've studied this a lot. Now, to begin with, I've changed jobs a lot. I've actually had 4 completely different careers. The first one was not by choice. I kind of had to leave the music profession because there wasn't I was a classical French horn player in the Barcelona orchestra, and that was a good job, but it didn't have a future to it. And I wanted to have a family. And so I went to college in my late 20s and early 30s, and I found there was other stuff that I was interested in, but I was kind of thrown into a new field. I became a behavioral scientist and at a relatively late in life. So for me now, changing is much easier. The reason it's much easier is because I've done it from French horn player to economist is a pretty big change. And I've learned, the fundamental truth in life, which is that everything is easy as long as you're not holding a French horn. For other people that haven't made these big changes, it's super scary because they think, what if I'm moving from something I don't like to something I like even less? And the data say it's probably overwhelmingly likely not to be the case. Almost everybody gets happier when they change jobs. Almost everybody gets happier. Now, the honeymoon is when you're happiest, and then it does come down, but not all the way back to where it was. And so I recommend to people that they kind of spiral in their careers. Every 7 to 12 years, they think of their career as a stack of mini careers of their own designation, and they kind of go do something new. Women are much better at this than men generally. Women will have, their first career after education, and then many will actually dial down what they're doing professionally and raise children for a little while, and then dial back up to part-time, then dial over to something else entirely. And that's one of the reasons that at the end of the day, women tend to say they've had a lot more career satisfaction than men because they're better at spiraling.
Arthur, do unhappy people dislike their work, or does work make people unhappy?
Yes. It's a vicious circle. And actually, this is one of the problems with people who are chronically dissatisfied with life, that all of their circumstances bring them down, and they bring down their circumstances. So you find that really unhappy people, they embitter their marriages, and their bitter marriages that make them unhappier. This is one of the reasons that one of the worst pieces of parenting advice I've ever gotten is that, well, it's not even advice. It's just kind of an observation that you're never happier than your unhappiest child. Well, newsflash, your kid doesn't want an unhappy parent. Nobody wants an unhappy spouse or an unhappy boss or an unhappy coworker. That's why I teach happiness, because happiness is an ethical obligation for all of us, not to be happy, but to work on our happiness. For some of us, happiness is harder than it is for other people. But if happiness is harder for somebody, the idea of giving up on it is a horrible thing to do. It's horrible for the people around you. It's horrible for yourself. Every single person listening to us can get happier. I mean, ultimate happiness is not the goal, because you're going to have negative emotions. If you didn't, you'd be dead in a week. You're going to have negative experiences because that's life on earth. But you can get much better at the skill of happiness, understanding your mind and brain better than you did before, to build your habits, to love others and teach it to everybody around you. And you can become a happiness teacher. As a matter of fact, that's what I want. I'm trying to create a whole generation of happiness teachers, because ultimately that's how we change our society.
I do think happiness is harder for some people than for others. I suppose I'm fortunate that I feel like a pretty content person. I never quite know what to do for the people in my life who struggle more to be happy. Like, there's only so much coaching you want from someone who's naturally able to see things on the sunny side.
Yeah, it's true. And there's certain people around us that don't want any coaching at all. You may have noticed, if you have teenage children, that they don't like being coached with respect to their happiness. But I have a special technique for that, by the way. And people ask me all the time, how do I share these ideas with my 17-year-old or something like that? I say, it's the oldest trick in the book. It's called the appeal to authority. Send them one of my YouTube videos, an edition of my podcast, or something that I've written. Say, I've been reading this thing or listening to this thing, and I'm not sure how I feel about it. Would you watch this and give me your opinion? And then it becomes dinner time conversation. And before you know it, you're actually having a discussion on something productive. And they Krys, they never catch on.
How can any one of us get better at receiving criticism that is meant to help us?
Yeah, it's a hard thing, and some of us are more defensive than others. I'm married to a Spaniard, and they're quarrelsome people by nature, but that's better than us because we're defensive people by nature. That's a volatile combination, as you can imagine. But the truth of the matter is that people around us who really love us give us a gift of feedback. They're not always right, but the truth is that while we don't want the truth, we need the truth, at least as far as the truth is according to people who are around us that we trust. And so it's good to get into, especially among families, of a climate of honesty and with friends of honesty, and to say pretty regularly, I want your feedback. And it's okay if I don't agree with you, but I need to know what you really think. That and then it becomes kind of a culture of that. And that's kind of cool, as a matter of fact. You know, the great hedge fund manager at Bridgewater Capital, Ray Dalio, everybody's heard of Ray Dalio, and he's a legendary figure. What he's most known for in the industry is having radical honesty and open criticism, even of him inside his company. And, you know, I heard him say pretty recently that he was giving a little presentation, and a 21-year-old intern wrote a feedback evaluation right after the meeting saying Ray didn't do his homework. Ray's slacking. Ray is, come on, man. I mean, he's the founder of the company. But the truth is, if you create a culture of that, then it becomes actually pretty easy to deal with, because as you're getting and giving and everybody's getting better, and then the people who are criticizing you are actually rooting for you to get better if you have the right culture.
I think this idea is really interesting, that we can use criticism as insider information, as feedback that we have solicited. But the point that you said, you don't necessarily have to agree with someone, is interesting, because I think sometimes people think if I'm to take criticism constructively, that means I then have to change everything I'm doing to please my critic. That's not necessarily the case.
No. And anybody who's doing work in public, like you or me, if you go online to look at what people are saying, if it's going really well, then it's 90% positive and 10% evil. And if the evil part is the part you're listening to, because we have a bias toward the negative, it's literally in psychology called the negativity bias. You pay attention to the people who are unhappy about you, because if you don't, that can become a very big problem for you in the ancestral environment. You know, somebody's smiling sweetly at you, and that's nice, but somebody's frowning angrily at you, you take note, because that could be a very big problem for you once you turn your back. And the result is that we do that online, we do that all around us. We give undue attention to the negative, but that's just one more piece of data. And all the data actually matters.
Should we also look critically at the praise people give us?
We should, because a lot of that's nonsense. It's that you're more likely to get somebody's true, unvarnished opinion that's negative. This is discounting Twitter, right? I mean, we're not talking about environments that are social media in general, disproportionately that are populated by people that have sociopathic traits. Trolls on the internet literally have a high propensity towards psychopathy. And so that's not where you're going to get negative feedback that's accurate. But when you're around other people that are giving you criticism, that's more likely to actually be accurate than the people who are just buttering you up, especially when you're in a position of authority, like a boss. You know, it's amazing to me how many CEOs I've talked to who actually think that their jokes are funny. Amazing.
Is the midlife crisis a real thing, or is that a cultural phenomenon?
That's an argument that psychologists have been having for a long time. The idea of the midlife crisis, I mean, it kind of goes back to, well, Gail Sheehy's famous book Passages that interviewed dozens and dozens of people, some of whom went on to have pretty significant career. John DeLorean was one of the interviewees, weirdly. And she believed, and a lot of people subsequently in pop science came to think that there's a crisis that naturally occurs. The truth is that we do have changes over the course of our lives. I've written an awful lot about the fact that the first part of your professional life and the first part of your adult life in general is characterized by something called fluid intelligence, which is intelligence that's based on working memory and innovation, focus, indefatigable energy. And the second part, starting in your 40s and 50s, but it really goes through your 80s and 90s as long as you have your marbles, is called crystallized intelligence. And that's based on pattern recognition and wisdom, not innovation as much as teaching capacity, instruction. And those are two very, very different things. What I find when it comes to burnout and midlife crises is that people are on the wrong curve. They're trying to do what they used to be good at. If you want to have a midlife crisis, try to keep doing what you were good at in your 20s and 30s when you're in your 40s and 50s. Trust me, folks. And this is what I do for a living. And if I were trying to do that, holy moly, I was writing academic journal articles so mathematically sophisticated in my 30s, I can't read them today. But now I'm 61 years old and I have an audience of about 500,000 people a week in the Atlantic, and they're non-specialists, and I'm writing about science. Why can I do that? Because I can talk in a way about science that people can understand because of my crystallized intelligence. I would fail trying to do what I was good at before. I succeed in doing what I'm good at now, and making a mistake of not getting on the right curve. Well, that's when you have a real midlife crisis.
So happiness in midlife and beyond is in part about recognizing the way that things have changed and adjusting accordingly.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, holding on to the past is always a really bad idea. I'm writing a column right now. It'll come out in a couple of months in the Atlantic. I'm usually 10 weeks out in my column. So, because I'm trying out the things I recommend. If they don't work, I don't publish. And it's interesting because I'm actually going to time it to my 34th wedding anniversary. And I have all these data on what my wife and I were probably looking for when we met each other. And then I have a whole bunch of really interesting research that shows that what we're looking for now, and it isn't the same. And so one of the best ways for you to be unhappy in your marriage is trying to do what attracted you, or to look for what attracted you when you were 27 and give what you thought your partner's attracted to at 27, as opposed to being a grown-up, being a 61-year-old, doing what the person actually wants and being the person you're trying to be. In general, if you want to have a big problem in your life, hold on to the past.
How can we make meetings less a source of dread for everyone involved?
Cancel them. Is the short answer. And I've written about this a lot because I feel strongly about it. I mean, it's one of the things that I have some data from a research firm on Wall Street called Irrational Capital, and they actually market. I don't have any fiduciary relationship with them at all. I just think their data is interesting. They have an electronically traded fund, an ETF, that selects for the portfolio companies that have high levels of workplace happiness. So they're in the top 20% in workplace happiness. And then they sell the companies that are no longer scoring this way in annual surveys, annual interior surveys, proprietary data. And one of the things that actually makes workers the happiest is an internal culture of efficiency with the workers' time. People know when you're wasting their time, and they hate it when you're wasting their. I mean, bosses don't understand that. They think, look, you're getting paid all the same. So if you come to a boring meeting that you don't need to be at, well, it's my problem, not yours. Well, that's wrong. People hate having their time wasted and their efforts wasted. People want to be effective and create value. That's just a fact. And so what the data say are very clear. And I've written about this several times over the past few years. The fewer meetings you have with the fewer people, especially fewer people who are not engaged in the meeting, the fewer of those meetings you have, the higher morale is going to be.
Harvard professor Arthur Brooks is my guest. His new book is The Happiness Files: Insights on Work and Life. You're listening to Think. I'm Krys Boyd. How can we get better, those of us who naturally don't do this easily, at speaking our minds about things we care about?
That takes practice, and it requires actually being in a few relationships where you trust the people. So one of the things that can be hard for this is if you're in a workplace situation where you don't trust your boss, or you have a kind of the sort of supervisor who says, I want your opinion, but actually doesn't want your opinion. Or you have a really defensive spouse who says, just tell me the truth, and actually doesn't want the truth, because every time you give the truth, the person actually blows up. You need a few people where you actually can do that. That's the first thing, is having an environment of trust and people that you actually trust to speak your mind. The second thing, however, is a little bit even more fundamental. When you tell people the truth, there's two environments, two spirits in which you can tell people the truth. One is the truth as a gift, and the other is the truth as a weapon. I know lots of people that are speaking truths, but they're doing it because they want to hurt other people. I mean, there are lots of things that I actually think at any given moment that I don't say for Pete's sake, because it actually wouldn't edify. It actually wouldn't lift anybody else up. And only doing it would only hurt somebody else's feelings, or who knows, give me some sort of a tactical advantage in a conversation. Well, I don't want to do that because I don't want to sacrifice relationships. I choose, I hope, and at my best, I choose to actually say hard truths when I'm offering these things up as a gift and love, and not under any other circumstances.
Trophies and awards and prizes are intended to make the recipient happy. How can they backfire for some people?
A lot of people, it's funny because I ran a big think tank in Washington, D.C. as the president for a long time. And I would go into a lot of politicians' homes and a lot of people who are big operators in Washington, D.C. And inevitably they had a wall in their office that was covered of pictures of them in, talking to presidents and heads of state, and the Pope, and, all these important people. And I would look at the pictures and, their hair was always a different color. And the reason is because a lot of these pictures were really, really old and they were hanging on to who they used to be. That's, for some people, that seems like a really good idea. You should have a trophy wall. But there's a pretty interesting article that came out recently in the Journal of Happiness Studies that ranked 68 common strategies for becoming a happier person. Dead last was a trophy room. Dead last was, was going over a list of your wins, was kind of an ego shrine. That's a bad way to do it, because really what it does is it reminds you used to be good. The truth is humans, it's not about arriving at a goal. It's a question of progress. You want to make progress, and you want to make progress every day. If you're struggling with a weight problem, for example, it's not very helpful to have a picture of you 15 years ago when you were at your ideal weight. That just reminds you that you're not today. On the contrary, make progress today toward your goal, and you're going to find yourself being a happier person.
As a happiness scientist, do you ever feel pressure to perform your own happiness for other people?
Well, let's just say that if I'm being a jerk in an airport, it's kind of off-brand. It's not something that I really want. And one of the reasons that I have quite publicly as a scholar, I do a lot of work in the public eye about this, is because I want to be held accountable to it. Not to be happy, but to be a good person, full of love, treat other people with respect and dignity. That's what I really want. And part of the reason for that is that treating other people with love and dignity and respect, this is one of the great secrets to happiness. Happiness does come hard to me. And, I come from very gloomy stock. The research is very clear. 50% of your base mood, your mood baseline, your affect baseline, which is not your happiness. It's evidence of your happiness. Happiness isn't a feeling, actually. But those moods the baseline moods that you get, how you wake up feeling most days, 50% of that's genetic. And it's hard. My parents had a tough time. Both of my parents. It was very, very, very tricky, I have to say. And so the result is that I was a behavioral scientist, but happiness didn't come easily to me. And the reason I got into the happiness business is my wife finally said, "Don't you have a PhD? Why don't you use it for something useful for once? Work on your own happiness." And she was dead right. So by the time I started dedicating myself to it, using the algorithm of learning, which is true in everything from golf to mathematics to happiness, which is learn the science, change your habits, teach others. That's how you learn anything. It's learn, do, teach. I mean, even surgeons, they say in medical school, watch one, do one, teach one. That's how you become an actually good surgeon. But that's true in happiness as well. So that's what I've been doing for years now. And over the past 6 years, I've been tracking my own well-being with that of my students, because I take the same tests that are validated psychometrically in the same way. And my happiness has risen, Krys, by 60% in the past 6 years.
I'm glad to hear it. Arthur C. Brooks is a professor at Harvard. He writes a weekly column for The Atlantic called How to Build a Life, and he has a new book out called The Happiness Files, Insights on Work and Life. Arthur, it is always a pleasure talking with you. Thank you for making time.
Thank you, Krys. It's lovely talking to you too.
Think is distributed by PRX, the Public Radio Exchange. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, anywhere you get podcasts, and at our website, think.kera.org. Again, I'm Krys Boyd. Thanks for listening. Have a great day.